I answer got it to that, do I? Are we good to go, Gordon? Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Jeff Whittam. I'm chairing this all under one banner meeting this evening, and we're here this evening to say to look at the launch of a book called Breaking Up the British State: Scotland, Independence and Socialism. Myself, I'm a lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian University, obviously speaking in a personal capacity. Politically non-aligned. I don't actually belong to any political organisation. I did belong to the Scottish Socialist Party, but the book, as many of you may be aware, is chiefly written by members of the Socialist Workers' Party, who are members of the All Under One banner movement. We're very fortunate tonight in having a couple of the authors with us. We've got Ian Ferguson and we've got Charlotte Ahmed, who have both contributed extremely well-written chapters. What, for me, one of the real strengths of the book is the putting the struggles that we're in at the moment, the struggle for Scottish independence, putting it into an historical analysis, if you like, chartering the history of the struggle and struggles for independence in several different ways. And for me, this is fundamentally important to understand where we're currently at. I think it's very important as we at a crucial stage politically and economically as to where we're going for, where the independence movement is going forward. What I mean by that is if we just look at the SNP, and again, I'm not casting aspersions, I'm not being judgmental on this, but you know, there are quite clear divisions within the Scottish National Party at this moment in time. We've seen the breakaway of the AUOB party. We've seen several resignations, and we've seen some intense debates taking place. But for me, again, one of the strengths of this particular book is trying to chart what are we actually fighting for? Yes, we're all fighting for independent Scotland. But what is that independent Scotland going to look like? Would it be enough just to rip down the Union flag and stick up the saltire and carry on as normal? Well, quite clearly, from the title of this book, what is being suggested, that the idea of a neoliberal capitalist Scotland is not on the agenda for socialists. And therefore, the question of what is the way forward for Scotland? What is going to be coming out of the other end of the independence when we get independence is of crucial importance. And these are some of the questions we want to try and tease out tonight. Now, the way we're going to go forward is I've got a few questions for our two authors, which I'm going to put to them at first to try and get some flavour, because I'm aware that all of you will not have read the book yet, but to try and tease out some of the main ideas of the book. And then we'll open it up. I'm being assisted tonight by Gordon, who's going to do all the fancy stuff. I mean, I lecture in innovation, but I'm the most uninnovative person you could actually meet, but that's another story. So Gordon will facilitate. So if you do want to contribute, then please raise your hand. You can use the chat box, and we'll be watching any contributions that come in through Facebook, so we can ask questions that way. Okay, so we'll get started. And really, my first question really is going to Ian Ferguson. Actually, you should introduce yourself. Ian, say hello to the listeners.
Hello, listeners. What an introduction. Right.
Well, I thought you might want to just say a little bit about yourself first.
Yeah, sure.
No? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Like Jeff, I'm also someone who, until a few years ago, taught in this case at University of the West of Scotland. I've been involved in Social Work Action Network, a radical campaigning social work organisation. But I've also co-authored with Gregor Gall a pamphlet called about People Before Profit: The Future of Social Care in Scotland, which makes the argument, and I may get a chance to say something like this a little bit later on, about why, if we're to avoid future catastrophes like the COVID catastrophe, the deaths of thousands of older people in care homes, why we need to nationalise social care in Scotland and kick out the profiteers. But maybe I can say a little bit about that later on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. Charlotte, do you want to say a couple of words about yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Ahmed. I am a retired teacher, a long-time socialist, anti-racist activist, member of the SWP, and I have co-authored with my friend and comrade Henry Maitles the chapter in the book called Racism and Anti-Racism in Scotland. And I am also elected to the now outgoing inaugural committee of the organisation called Now Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Charlotte. Okay, then. So, really, this first question is one for Ian. Now, you've written this book about the independence movement and Scottish history from this socialist perspective. Why do socialists support Scottish independence? And we know from Marx's writings and the left as a whole, the national question has been problematic for the left. I would say. Let's leave it to that. Anyway, why is this important for socialists?
Okay, thanks, Jeff, and thanks first of all to you all under one banner for hosting this tonight, and for the good people who have turned up on this sunny evening to listen to it. I think, as Jeff has said, the book is written from an explicitly socialist, actually explicitly Marxist perspective. So we see ourselves writing in the tradition not just of Marx and Engels, but also of the great Scottish revolutionary John Maclean. So that means a couple of things. First of all, it means that we are not nationalists. We're not writing from a nationalist perspective. In fact, one of the central arguments of the book is that Scottish workers not only have nothing in common with the rich and powerful in Scotland, people like Benny Higgins, who is now Nicola Sturgeon's economic advisor, people like Brian Souter, but actually we have opposing interests. And as Jeff hinted in his introduction, that means there are very, very different visions of independence, of what independence will mean. And we fight for one of these visions in this book. The fact that it's not a nationalist perspective also means, and Charlotte, I think, will say a little bit about this, more about this later, is that we do not see Scotland as an oppressed nation. That's not our argument for independence. Actually, the history of Scotland in the 18th and since the Union is very, very different, for example, from the history of a country like Ireland. So these are not our reasons for arguing for independence. Rather, our argument, actually similar in some respects to Maclean's argument in 1921, is that an independent Scotland, even more so an independent Scottish Workers' Republic, would strike a massive blow against the British state and against imperialism. So I think probably the clue to our first argument for independence is in the title of the book. In other words, we want to see the breakup of the British state. If there's one thing we've learned from the Black Lives Matter movement over the past couple of years, it's the role that Britain and Glasgow and Scotland played in the slave trade. But all the way through, from the beginning of empire, Britain has basically, the empire where the sun never set and the blood never dried, whether we're talking about India, Africa, or whatever. And today, essentially, a broken Britain would no longer be able to engage in the kind of illegal wars we've seen in the past few years. A kind of horrible sight just now we see of Boris Johnson entertaining his G7 pals in Cornwall. So the first argument would be it would weaken British nationalism, it would weaken British ideology, it would undermine the rights. So that's the first thing. But the second thing I'll just say briefly is that I think a second argument lies in that wonderful movement we saw way back in 2014, a movement which was compared by one mainstream writer. He said a little whiff of Tahrir Square, that wonderful sense of people fighting for something different. And I'm sure, like a lot of people here, I went to many meetings in 2014 where people would stand up and say, I'm not a nationalist, but I want to see a different kind of Scotland. I want to challenge austerity. I want to fight inequality. So essentially, we think the movement that developed in 2014, and which, to its enormous credit, all under one banner, has done a huge amount to sustain since then, actually offers the real hope. The real hope does not lie, frankly, in Holyrood. The real hope lies in the movement that developed then. And I think it's a movement which gave enormous hope to large numbers of people. It's a movement which relies on our strength in the communities and in the workplace. And it's really that movement, as well as historical movements, as Jeff said, that we want to promote in the book, and the book argues that we need to develop.
Okay, and thanks very much indeed. That's a very full answer. And you know, and I think Charlotte's chapter, which is focusing on anti-racist struggles, again captures that that historical perspective, and particularly the role of British imperialism, which of course Scotland was a part of, and Charlotte's chapter is very informative on that aspect. Turning to yourself, Charlotte, now. What we saw on the 6th of May with the Holyrood elections. Sorry, that's a Mancunian coming out of me, sorry. We've now got this independence, majority of independence within the Scottish Parliament. Is this now forward to Indy Ref 2, would you say? You know, when are we going to push, and when are we going to get this Indy Ref 2?
Yeah, good question. Hello, everyone. Well, it's now, what, 6 weeks since that May the 6th election, where I think we have to say it's quite remarkable that the SNP are still, you know, a political monolith in Scotland after their record in the Scottish Parliament over over a decade now, and also that they have, along with the Greens, a parliamentary majority pro-Indy, and yet 6 weeks into it, there is not a hint of a campaign, not a hint of a plan. There are some vague promises about we will have a plan for Indy Ref 2 sometime this Parliament, but nothing else. And this, of course, has been the case for some time. It has led, as people have mentioned already, to splits in the movement, frustrations within the SNP coming out in various ways, expressed through various means, a new party, etc., new groups like the one that I'm in now, Scotland. And the truth is that there is no sense of urgency coming from the SNP at all. And yet, from the other side, the unionist side, the Westminster Parliament, with Boris Johnson's 80-strong majority, they're very worried. They see the danger developing, not just in Scotland, but Ireland, but Wales as well. And they're actually doing something about it. They've got a propaganda unit now set up that's been financed. We see the effects of this already, partly expressed through the culture wars, the Union Jacks everywhere. And you can't go and get your weekly shop without Union Jacks on your food. You've got instructions not to fly the Saltire outside government buildings, and don't mention Scotland as a nation. They're going to find that a bit difficult with the Euro 2020 starting. I already heard reference to the Welsh nation a few times on the BBC. No doubt they'll get the knuckles up for that. But serious, they are taking it seriously. They are worried. And every time the ruling class wheel out Gordon Brown to front some sort of campaign, you know that they are worried, because let's face it, you wouldn't turn to him under any other circumstances. And you've got the propaganda of GMB, this new broadcast, Fox-type news broadcasting with the character Neil Oliver. I mean, what a ridiculous character. He's already said that lockdown is the worst thing that's ever happened in the world. I mean, come on, take this seriously, please. So we know the propaganda of the other side, and we know from 2014 the extent to which they will pull strings, pull their friends and allies to support the unionist cause, both their friends and allies in Scotland, of whom they still have some. You know, the Labour Party hasn't committed to supporting Indy Ref 2, never mind supporting independence. And of course, the Better Together, the Project Fear, that will all be rolled out. And they're beginning that, and yet nothing from the SNP, nothing. And there are discussions within our own movement about, do we want to put all our eggs into the indirect 2 basket? There is going to be lots of other discussions about strategy and tactics, I'm sure. But whatever that is, I think that the only way we are going to get the democratic right and the frequently expressed democratic will of the Scottish people to be enacted to independence is for a mass movement of people from below. That is the only way that we are going to shift the levers in our favour. And I think that is what the SNP are afraid of. All parties that rely on what is a broad class alliance, friends with the bankers, friends with the landowners, but also friends with the people, we want to keep that alliance together. As Ian already referenced, the committee that they have got together is chaired by this Bernie Higgins character, who's a factor. He's a former investment banker and a factor for a landowner. That's not somebody that, with a party with the interests of the Scottish people at their heart will have as an advisor on what to do about independence. The Growth Commission, they've sort of sidelined the Growth Commission. It was a neoliberal document saying how to keep capitalism safe in an independent Scotland. None of these policies that the SNP have come up with are going to get us independence or motivate people to fight for independence. So it would be good to think that now we were on the road to independence after this unprecedented victory of this SNP, this very, very successful middle-class centrist party. They're not going to lead this movement. So one of the reasons that Now Scotland exists, there's lots of groups as well, and it's remarkable, I would say, how the movement has maintained itself at the grassroots, with the Yes groups and other groups maintaining their organisation throughout the ups and downs of the electoral cycle. We need to step it up. We need a different approach. We need a different sort of politics. And I think this is where the socialism comes in, and you'll get this movement. In history, when ordinary people have fought for something, that's how you win it. You will not get it gifted by the powers that be and the class that benefits from the existing system. And that is as true for Scottish independence as it is for anything else. So what I would like to look forward to is that mass movement hitting the streets against once lockdown is lifted and making demands on the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster government. It is, after all, our right to decide.
Brilliant, Charlotte. And that's a fantastic way to lead me into a follow-up question in some ways. It's ways to Ian, which is actually, again, coming from the book we've got the historical narrative of struggles of working class people. Well, in fact, in some way, in some respects, there's reflections on pre-industrial times of struggles of people for land, for example. But really, we go through some of and you identify the point that Charlotte was making, that when people do stand up, ordinary working people do stand up, that's when we get real change. So, I mean, what do you take, Ian, from these historical struggles which throughout history that Scotland's been engaged in, or the Scottish people have been engaged in?
I think there's a lot of lessons in following on from Charlotte. I think one of the very inspiring things about the book is if we look at the historical episodes of struggle, whether it's the Radical Rising in 1820, the Chartist movement and so on, where workers have made links with other workers. And interestingly, and it's a point we may return to, but throughout many of these struggles, it was struggles that were closely linked to the struggles south of the border, where there was a lot of communication and a lot of organisation with workers in England from 1820 onwards. But where workers have relied on their own strength and their own struggle, then they have often been successful. I think one of the lessons also from the book is that where workers look to electoralism and look to other people to do it for them, then that's actually where things fall apart. And even if you look more at some recent struggles, for example, the bedroom tax in Scotland. Now, it's good that actually some concessions were made by the SNP government, but frankly, these concessions would not have happened had it not been for the struggles from below. So I think that's one of the key lessons that we need to focus on building that movement from below. And I think just look at some of my notes. Again, as Charlotte mentioned, there are different ways in which these struggles can be derailed, but I think that as well as the success stories in the book, we also look at some of the weaknesses. And one of these weaknesses precisely where, rather than relying on their own strength and their own organisation, we have looked to nationalist arguments have actually diverted the struggle. So, for example, during the 84-85 miners' strike, the argument was that Scotland Steel, which meant that huge amounts of steel were allowed to go into the Ravenscraig plant, which seriously undermined the miners' strike in Scotland. And that argument, that notion, which has come up again quite often in struggles over the past 20, 30, 40 years about the Scottish case, which involves uniting all of us as Scots together, has again and again derailed the movement. So I think the kind of key lessons I think that come out of the book about struggles is the importance of building building our own organisation, our own strength, and particularly rooting that strength in the workplaces. Although there haven't been enough successful industrial struggles in recent years, one of the most important victories I think we've seen in Scotland has been the equal pay strike, the equal pay women winning that fantastic strike a couple of years ago, using their strength in the workplace. We need to see much more of that. But I think just more generally, in the past couple of years, even during the pandemic, the impact of a movement like Black Lives Matter, which has actually achieved more in the space of a couple of years, and all the strategy of simply getting black faces into high places has done for a long time. So I think that really the key single lesson that comes out of the book is that it's relying on our own organisation, our grassroots strength from below, not relying on the SNP. And finally, I think it also means that we actually have to, I think the book is about being honest with people, that we actually have to say that the struggle for independence will not be a walk in the park. We've seen the experience of Catalonia. We have to learn from these struggles. We have to know that Johnson is not simply going to agree to give independence, and that actually means building an organisation and seriously discussing the kind of strategy we need to take to actually win.
Thanks a lot, Ian. Okay, so we're moving on slightly now, just to cover another aspect, really, which is in the book, and really short. Many people would look back to the Act of Union as the time when Scotland lost its independence, and we really saw the formation of what has become known as Great Britain. Or as Alexis Sale sort of questioned, why the hell is it Great Britain? What's wrong with not bad Britain? We don't have very good France. Anyway, but that's an aside. But the point is, how does the book actually handle this, the development of the British state and the consequence, and what the consequences of that have been for Scotland?
Yes, as Mark said, people make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. And if you look at Scottish history, it's so used, it's romanticised, mythologised. It's even used, to underpin the Game of Thrones and things like that. There's so much richness in it. You want murder, betrayal, brutality, duplicitous treachery. You'll find it in Scottish history. But one of the attitudes this book takes is that history is not a continuity. This is not a continuous struggle from the wars of independence of Robert the Bruce, etc., etc., etc. No, history is punctuated with revolts and revolutions. Some are successful, some are not. And I think there's a particular chapter on the Union and the formation of the, if you like, Great Britain. And if you look at 1707, what I would certainly argue is that this union of the Parliament was a discussion between the ruling class of England and the ruling class of Scotland. and it was born out of material conditions at the time. It wasn't an invasion, it wasn't a takeover, it wasn't the oppressor oppressing Scotland. It was a negotiated contract between what we call the bourgeoisie as Marxists, but the ruling class of Scotland and of England, at a time of a great change in the economic system of the world, moving from feudalism into capitalism. And at that time, the exploitation of slaves in the plantations, the tobacco and the sugar plantations in America, the beginning of the acquisition of empire, which is a bit later in the development of this, but nevertheless, Scottish ruling class, the landowners of Scotland, the great families of Scotland, wanted a piece of that. And having tried to do something like that themselves as a Scottish ruling class in Darien, it was a disaster. A little bit of a South American state in which Scotland would control the economy, the plantations, etc. It was a total disaster. And it was about, it's estimated anything between a fifth to a half of the entire capital money of Scotland was sunk into that disaster. And therefore, coming out of that and seeing the opportunities that were there, but nevertheless, the consequences of going it alone, given that you were threatened by England's interests, possibly France's, Spain's, etc., this band of warring brothers, this emerging ruling class, capitalist ruling class, the few hundred Scottish well-known parcel of rogues made the decision that they would go into business with the English ruling class. And that's what the Union of the Parliaments was. It was not something in which the majority of Scots had a say. They weren't consulted. And it is not something that many Scots welcomed. There were riots, there were demonstrations, etc. But it was a business transaction to go into partnership. Okay, you could say because of the economy in Scotland at the time, the conditions that were largely rural, the feudal aspects of how Scotland was run at the time, and if you like, some carrots were given to entice people to take, if you like, welcome this union. The Church of Scotland would maintain its independence, the system of law, certain aspects of education, etc. Some of these institutions that are still with us would retain their independence. But on the other hand, the threat of, well, you will not have the right to your conquests, we will contest you for them, etc., etc. So that was 1707. I don't accept, and we don't accept the argument that it was a takeover, or in the way that, for example, Britain took over and invaded Ireland and then made Ireland as a colony through vicious oppression, through clearing people off the land, suppressing the language, etc. Now, aspects of that did happen when, after the Jacobite uprising in 1745, the 45, but then that's mythologized as well. Actually, many of the people who were involved in the army at the time were Scottish, fighting against a system that they didn't recognize, the Highland tradition, which was basically feudalism, how feudalism was run in Scotland. But the whole thing is about the maintenance of capitalism, the growth of capitalism, the acquisition of empire through brutality, through invasion and oppression, and the looting of empire and the wealth from slavery, which then came flooding into Scotland. Glasgow became the second city of empire through this. And although it is certainly the case that that wealth was not evenly distributed, as we know, and the book talks about this, how the development of the Scottish working class, etc. Nevertheless, that union was the act of the ruling class in favour of the ruling class, not in the interest of the mass of ordinary people. But it was by no means a complete and takeover or oppression of Scotland by England. It was a partnership involving the ruling class, not ordinary people in England or in Scotland. They had no say.
Once again, Charlotte, you've done it again. This leads us very conveniently into a follow-up question to Ian, because this idea of the agreement. I guess what we've seen in recent times is, with the devolution settlement, we're seeing Scotland being granted limited powers to make decisions for itself in many ways, and really when we're looking at the recent record of the SNP in government, wouldn't it be fair to say that, given the limited powers that the SNP have got and have had, they haven't done a bad job. Things have, the neoliberalism which is occurring down south. If you look at the privatisation contracts that are being given out in the NHS down in England, is not happening to the same extent in Scotland. So, surely if we had an SNP government after independence, Scotland would be doing fine.
Sure. It's a good question, Jeff. I think certainly we've now had an SNP government for 14 years. So I think it is a good time to really evaluate what's happening. Certainly there are things which all of us would support, like free personal care, like the absence of a market in the NHS and so on. But actually, if you dig a bit deeper, the problems since the SNP came to power have not only not gone away, but in some cases have actually got worse. So, for example, a report published by the Scottish Government in early 2020 showed that people who live in the most deprived parts of the country are now 4 times more likely to die early than they were 20 years ago. Health inequalities have massively increased, mortality rates. We have the biggest drug-related death problem in Europe, and homelessness rates are higher than elsewhere. So clearly these problems have not gone away, have got worse. And I think it is actually quite reasonable to ask, could the SNP have done more? And I think that there's really 2 bits to the answer to that question. First of all, have they used the powers that they have to do all that they could have done? I think that the short answer to that is no. So, for example, despite these massive inequalities, Scotland still being one of the most unequal countries in Europe, one of the main commitments in the SNP's recent parliamentary manifesto was that they would not increase income rates in the lifetime of this parliament. In other words, the wealthy will not be taxed. So I think that's the first thing, and that also means another aspect of that is that another thing that we've seen recently in Scotland during the COVID crisis is actually that the death toll in older people's homes is actually higher in Scotland than it has been south of the border. More than 3,500 old people died in homes. Now, if you look at what that's about, a recent publication by the Crown Office showed that in the vast majority of cases, these deaths occurred in homes owned by companies like HC1, like Four Seasons and so on, with their headquarters in offshore tax havens. So basically one would have thought that this should be an obvious area for the SNP to be addressing. In fact, in the recent independent commission set up by Nicola Sturgeon, whose recommendations were accepted by Sturgeon, specifically rules out nationalising these homes or these companies. So the reality is a company like HC1 is able to declare, as it did last month, it's going to close another 10 homes in Scotland, with dozens of residents, dozens of staff being thrown into total insecurity, and the SNP is going to do absolutely nothing about it. So I think that's the first thing, that they actually, with the powers that they already have, could have done much more, both to challenge inequality and to challenge the rich in Scotland. But even beyond that, when we look at what the SNP's vision of an independent Scotland is, and I have to say, in researching this for the chapter in the book, I was slightly shocked myself, right, at just how neoliberal that vision is. And we got a taste of that in the Growth Commission that came out in 2018, in which the SNP, as well as committing themselves to continuation of the monarchy, remaining in NATO and so on, also announced that for the next 10 years we'd be keeping the pound, so we'll be subject to exchequer in London, and we'd probably face 10 10 years of austerity to get the deficit down. And that again has been reinforced. A more recent report, the post-COVID recovery, has been headed by a guy who I mentioned about earlier on, Benny Higgins. Now, until about 3 or 4 months ago, I'd never heard the name Benny Higgins. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, Benny Higgins was part of the triumvirate with Fred Goodwin, who was responsible for the crash of the role of RBS in 2008. Then went on to become head of Tesco Bank and now manages the estates of the Duke of Buccleuch, the second largest landowner in Scotland. And this is the man whom Nicola Sturgeon has appointed to lead us out of the recovery. Not surprisingly, his plan is one which completely puts business and private enterprise right at the centre. So I think we have to say that the SNP's vision of Scotland is very different from the vision we present in the book. And I think we also have to say it's a vision which, frankly, will not only do nothing to challenge the poverty, the inequality, the homelessness, the drug-related death in Scotland, but actually will not be able to achieve independence, because the reality is it's not a vision that's going to inspire the vast mass of working class people to fight for the kind of independence we need. So I think it is fair. It's fine to say that the SNP have done some positive things, but frankly, given the task that is required, given the kind of movement we need, I think they fall very far short of that.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian. And really, I think that brings us nicely. This is working pretty well, actually, because that brings us into my next question, really, which is for Charlotte. I mean, the title of the book, you know, is Breaking Up the British State: Scotland, Independence and Socialism. And really, you're talking about independence and socialism. Surely, because of the mass movement that we've got for independence, surely we should get the independence bit done first, and then we can start talking about socialism or whatever after. Let's get the independence done. I mean, how do you respond to colleagues and comrades and friends and people who are in the independence movement who are banging that drum? Let's get the independence, let's get IndyRef 2 done first, and then we'll talk about the socialism. You know, you can have your debates and discussions about socialism after we've got our independence.
Yeah, students of socialism will know we've heard this before. It's echoed through the last century of history. And the truth is that waiting doesn't work. I mean, if these people that say, you know, keep the politics out of it, keep the issues out of it, and let's just talk independence and get independence, well, why haven't you done it then? You know, you've had how many SNP governments? You've had, I don't know how many times we're going to demonstrate in the streets, huge demonstrations in the streets of Scotland, 200,000 reckoned in Edinburgh, the last big one that all under one banner organised, and an ever increasing support in the polls for independence, over 50% now, regularly. Why isn't it happening? And I think there are reasons to do with the SNP leadership of this movement, which Ian has touched on. I mean, they're not committed to the sort of social transformation of society that I think will be required to deliver it. But the reason why people are increasingly looking to independence is not independence in and of itself. It's because independence will possibly deliver the things and that change in society that they want. And this is where the politics come in. You can't escape politics today. I mean, 2014 saw a flowering of activism on politics and different political issues coming into the movement. One of the things that I'm arguing within Now Scotland is that we should welcome and bring that into the movement to a much greater extent than has been the case so far. What do I mean? Broadening and deepening the independence movement to include more political activism in it, not less. Climate change. Nicola Sturgeon's declared a climate emergency. If that's an emergency, she hasn't done very much about it. all the stuff that COVID has highlighted in people's lives, the precarious unemployment, the quality of the housing, people, the rise of the working poor in food banks, the health care, as Ian's touched on, social care, inadequate to the needs of society. And you also see the other side is that people are making millions out of the pandemic. Not just in Scotland too, in Britain as a whole and in the world. This is a system that is failing on multiple levels, and more people understand it because their lives are being impacted by it. And there's no sense of this from the SNP, people who seemingly want to transform the Scottish society. And that's what the movement has to bring into it. We want, where is the greatest support for independence in Scottish society? The young. Where are the young in the leadership of the movement? They're not there, partly because they distrust political parties for all sorts of reasons. But they're also because they're being active in the climate movement, in, Black Lives Matter. If you think of Kenmure Street in Pollokshields a few weeks ago, people power, people taking to the street spontaneously, a sense of community and that we're all in this together. Complete opposite to what the Tories represent in the Westminster Parliament. The jobs for cronies, billions of pounds of public money poured into private pockets, taxpayers' money, unaccountable, just absolute corruption and lies. It's the complete opposite of that I want to see in this movement. People fighting for each other for a better society for the future. Call that a vision if you like. I think people like Leslie Riddick have correctly pointed out, where is the vision from the SNP? There isn't any. There's nothing inspiring. They seem to have run out of ideas. And I do not believe that leaving this movement up to politicians who have time and time again shown they would rather listen to a banker or a corporate interest than the people, the 200,000 in the streets of Edinburgh, for example, they are not going to transform society in the way that people want. And again, I come back to this idea that capitalism is failing. I mean, ultimately, this is what this book is about. Capitalism is failing as a system. It is not delivering to people even the most basic needs of life. In some parts of the world, it could be housing, it could be water, it could be healthcare. The extent of sexual harassment of women and girls, even in our schools. I mean, I've been campaigning on this issue for decades, and I was shocked at what people are saying about their experiences of their day-to-day life. The experience, the whole thing about taking the knee and the social media racism that our players at the European competition are going to be subjected to, and yet fans are booing them. There's so many things that are politicizing people. Why can't our independence movement do that? And although I don't think independence in and of itself will solve these problems, we can say to people that a better world is possible if you take part in creating it and don't rely on the politicians. And for people who, I know there's a phrase that somebody said to me recently about, the sort of turmoil in the independence movement. It's a bit like rearranging the deck chairs. It sounds like cold kale warmed up. We don't want cold kale. We want a new vision. We want new people involved in that movement. And we have the chance to do it because I think they're actually quite frail. If we organise this properly with the right levers in our society, and trade unions, for example, my own union, the EIS, at their conference at the weekend, they voted on a resolution that acknowledged the right of the Scottish people to determine their own government. Now that's as far as that goes. How do you then enact that though? But that's a welcome move of trade unions who have so traditionally been part of the Labour, absolutely no to independence. Now that is breaking. So I'm quite optimistic that, the people, the naysayers say, don't bring politics into it, are going to be proved wrong. And if we get this right, I think that we will be able to break up the British state, that we will be able to give inspiration to other people to fight for their democratic rights and to build a better society.
Brilliant, Charlotte. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, right. The floor is open now. I haven't got access to Facebook. Somebody's following Facebook. Is there any questions from Facebook? Anybody want to ask any questions, please indicate, please raise your hand. There's a function somewhere on the on Zoom that you can raise your hand. Or please just type in the chat box any questions. Whilst we're just waiting for people to think of questions, I'm just wondering, all under one banner, is there any events coming up in the near future?
Who's going to answer that?
I think you are, Charlotte.
I am, right. Okay. Yes, there is. There is the 26th of this month, Saturday. There's a rally at Bannockburn. Now, we are going to keep in, I'm sure that that's an all under one banner thing, which I'm not part of. I support. In fact, I think I'm going to be speaking at it. It will be socially distanced and safe according to the guidelines that are out at the time. But there's plenty of room for people to socially distance up there at that venue. And on the 24th, which is the Thursday, this is the last week of the Scottish parliamentary session, and we wouldn't like them to go away to their homes without realising that there is a movement out there that's going to continue throughout the summer period. So the Committee of Now Scotland is asking people to gather outside the Scottish Parliament on the 24th, Thursday the 24th of June at 11 o'clock. And just to remind those politicians inside that we are still going to be outside and we're still going to be building this campaign. And we would like to invite all independence groups to send representatives to that, particularly the local yes groups who can get there relatively easily, and send them on their holidays with their ears ringing.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Bob Fotheringham. Actually, Bob is one of the authors of a chapter in the book as well. So welcome, Bob. Please give us your question.
Yeah, thanks, folks. That was a good introduction from Ian and Charlotte. Thanks a lot. I want to focus on something slightly different. If you look at some recent events in the last election, Scottish Parliament, with an SNP majority, and well, actually it's an independence majority. The SNP just fell short of an overall majority actually in the Parliament, but if you add in the Greens, there's an overall majority for independence. In the north of Ireland, there is a growing movement which looks like the possibility of Ireland uniting will take place in the not too distant future. And obviously there's a lot of hurdles to overcome there, but I mean there's a growing feeling that the possibility of United Ireland's there, seriously. If you look in Wales, the recent election at the same time as the Scottish Parliament took place, the Labour Party did well, but in all of most of the constituencies where the Labour Party won, Plaid Cymru were in second place. So independence is a gathering movement in Wales, and in some respects the same trajectory as Scotland. Think back on why Scotland actually ended up moving from Labour to the SNP, because they ended up in Scotland voting Labour and getting a Tory government that's feeling a democratic deficit. And it looks like the same trajectory to a certain extent is happening in Wales. I think what people have got to grasp is that there is a serious threat here to the British state. It's a kind of a real serious problem, which I think, if you look in the bourgeois press, there's a growing awareness that this is a huge issue. But the question I really want to come back to then is one of the things we're always argued with people, particularly on the left who don't support independence, is that breaking up the British state will break up the British working class. So what I want to ask Ian and Charlotte, how do we see that? How do we respond to that question? And at the end of the day, what do English workers get out of Scottish independence? You know, what benefits do they get out of Scottish independence if Scotland becomes an independent country? So are we talking about breaking up the British working class? And what benefits is there for English workers out of Scottish independence?
Thanks, Bob. That's a really interesting question. Charlotte, Ian, who fancies going first?
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. I've always thought this is a bit of a false argument, and I've heard this before. I know I can understand the instinct, because one of the great principles of a working class movement is solidarity. Solidarity with workers in your own section, between sections, and across borders. But I'll come back to the old cliche that the working class doesn't have any borders. You know, we will be working class. You can deliver solidarity to workers anywhere in the world, particularly with modern technology. So, you know, that's not going to be an obstacle to delivering solidarity for workers. I think that's false. I think the way in which workers in England in particular would benefit is that they see that the British state and the Tories in particular can be defeated. And it would also show, if you like, drive a bit of a wedge between the working class and adherents to Union Jack, monarchy, British imperialism, that sort of backward-looking Toryism that is so dominant today, you know, after Brexit. I was intrigued recently in the debate about the cuts to international aid. So there's a Tory revolt against their own government cutting international aid, which might quite surprise you until you listen to the argument that this guy was putting. And this guy was putting the argument that this is part of Britain's soft power post-Brexit. You know, it was like a colonial attitude, supporting international aid as another arm of the British state's power in the world, albeit soft power, even as they're sending gunboats to Gibraltar and sending the Navy to stop immigrants crossing the Channel and other such things. I mean, really, if this would, you know, at the very least, lead workers to question their allegiance to this state, to this Union Jack, and therefore that would, in my mind, would only strengthen the working class. Plus, it would be an inspiration. You know, this little country, this 5.5 million people on the edge of Europe, can win this at their democratic right. Then it's possible to do so in other countries as well. So yeah, I can understand in part this argument about the solidarity of the working class, but that's going to be there with an independent Scotland, just as it is now.
Do you want to add anything in? You're on mute.
So it must be Zoom. Just to say that solidarity, whether or not solidarity takes place between different groups of workers, does not depend on the existence of the state or not. The state usually gets in the way. Basically, I think the fact that there's not more solidarity is sometimes due to the fact that trade union leaders don't organise it. But I think actually through the book we've got lots of examples of English and Scottish workers acting in solidarity with each other, and it's about workers making direct links and going out and organising speaking tours and so on and so forth. And I think Charlotte's right. I think actually a successful struggle for Scottish independence, particularly if the struggle is for a clearly anti-Tory struggle, a struggle against austerity, a struggle for an anti-racist Scotland, I think would be a massive inspiration to workers south of the border who would support that struggle. So I think this notion, which I think most extreme form we hear from people like George Galloway, that the breakup of the British state would somehow weaken the British working class movement is actually a myth. I think a successful anti-Tory struggle by Scottish workers would actually inspire workers everywhere. And we only have to look at a very, very small example of it. But I spoke to comrades south of the border after the Pollock Shields demonstrations, and I don't think there's any question that the inspiration that people gathered from that victory in Pollock Shields fed into the Palestine demonstrations a few days later. So I think in the same way as the Black Lives Matter struggles and so on have inspired us. So I think it's struggle that unites and builds solidarity, not state structures.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian. Okay, have we got any more questions? Is there anybody on Facebook asking anything?
No, there's not.
Okay, I mean, there is one question I've got. Do you think that when Scotland win the Euros, do you think that that will help the independence cause?
It depends by how much.
Okay. Sorry, did we get something in the chat there? Okay. Well, listen, I don't think there's any more questions. So I'd just like to thank everybody for attending, and particularly I'd like to thank for all under one banner for organising this book launch. So just once again, what we've been discussing this evening is breaking up the British state, Scotland, independence and socialism. It's available from Bookmarks. I guess if you Google Bookmarks, that'll take you where you need to go, and it's it is a very good read. And like I say, I've learned so much. I'm not an historian at all, but actually, we all think of the Highland clearances, what have you, and I actually discovered that there are actually lowland clearances that occurred as well. So it's excellently written, and for me, what was very impressive is the contemporary nature of it. And you were talking about events and reporting on news stories that have been happening in 2021. So, it's bang up to date, even though we've been talking about the historical perspective that the book is set in. So I can't recommend it highly enough. You won't agree with all of it, I'm sure, but it's great for getting debate going, and it's very informative. So thanks very much indeed for everybody who's attended. Thanks for all under one banner for hosting. Get hold of the copy from Bookmarks. Thanks to Ian, thanks to Charlotte, and thanks to Gordon, who's been doing all the technical stuff. So until next time, thanks very much.